In this paper, I will look into the reasons of why judicial reform was started only in 2014 in Ukraine. In order to understand the process of judicial reform, it's useful to look into the background of the judicial system in Ukraine. Ukraine became an independent state in 1991 after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Unfortunately, Ukraine inherited a socialist legal system that had an aim of protecting Socialist Party. It used selective application of law and overall was dependent on other political forces and was unequal. In 1996, Ukraine established its constitution, stating that Ukraine is a market economy, and it also declared the independence of judiciary through separation of power, even though de facto judiciary stayed dependent on the executive and legislative branches of power. In 1995, Ukraine joined the Council of Europe, and that enabled it to be a recipient of financial aid to reform judiciary. However, the reforms or attempts of reforms were not implemented properly, and judiciary stayed dependent on other branches of power and lacked rule of law. So Ukraine had an opportunity to reform its judiciary in 90s and early 2000s, however it didn't happen. And my research question is what was the driving force behind the judicial reform implementation in 2014? Since in 2014, after the revolution, it is evident that a broad reforming process took place after the new administration signed the association agreement with the EU. One of the conditions of this agreement was the respect of fundamental freedoms and the rule of law. European Union experts and the Council of Europe helped Ukraine to finance the judicial reform as well as to implement it. In order to understand why judicial reform of 2014 was started only in 2014, I used the work of Finemore and Seeking on the norm life cycle, where they argue that it is hard to determine the time of when the reform is going to appear and when it is going to be implemented. However, they offer certain conditions that might influence the time of their appearance. One of those conditions is a political crisis, since it can act as a motivator for the state to adopt new reforms. That was a case with Ukraine in 2014, since administration of Yanukovych did not manage to implement, to sign an association agreement with the EU, and that triggered a popular uprising from civil society side and the population. They managed to overthrow the government and the Yanukovych administration. The revolution demanded a closer cooperation with the EU and the signing of the association agreement. Another condition that Finemore and Seeking argue for is the intrinsic quality of the norm. That means that some norms are just better than others, and they have a higher chance of being accepted by the population and the government. And the rule of law and independence of judiciary are one of those norms that are generally accepted by the international community and that are part of European standards. And since Ukrainian side is trying to move closer to Europe and to cooperate closely with Europe, it felt like it's time to adopt those reforms. Another condition that is offered by Finemore and Seeking is the need for legitimacy. In the case of Ukraine, I divided it into internal and external legitimacy. since after the revolution, new administration needed to prove to Ukrainian population that it is going to meet its demands, meaning closer cooperation with the European Union through the association agreement and the implementation of reforms, as well as the external acceptance or legitimacy, where Ukraine managed to sign the association agreement and had to implement new reforms, including the one on independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. Therefore, it can be stated that political crisis and the need for legitimacy influenced the time of the judicial reform appearance. This reform is being supervised by the Council of Europe and the European Union, and Ukraine is welcoming the help from those institutions. According to the work of Jeffrey Chekel on why states comply with new norms, there are several conditions that might influence the state on how easily it can be persuaded to implement new norms. One of the conditions is the novel and uncertain environment, and I believe that it applies to the Ukrainian case since previous political orientation of Ukraine was towards the Commonwealth of Independent States, most importantly Russia, and Russia does not de facto adhere to the rule of law and the independence of judiciary, and therefore Ukraine found a partner who could guide it through the reform implementation on the rule of law and independence of judiciary. It also should be noted that new administration was relatively inexperienced with the reform process, since it didn't have any prior experience in successful judicial reform implementation, and the administration that was elected was quite new. The last condition that should be mentioned is that European Union is an authoritative figure for Ukraine, since Ukrainian civil society as well as the Ukrainian government wants a closer cooperation with the EU and believes that the reform is a prerequisite of becoming a member of the EU. The goal of the judicial reform is to create a trusted legal system that is supported by the Ukrainian civil society and is independent from other branches of government, legislative and executive. The first changes that were taken to achieve that goal was to disable the judicial institutions that were suspected of unethical behavior and to renew the judicial structure of 1996. Presidential Justice Reform Council also established a strategy for the reform implementation that was called Judicial Sector Strategy 2014-2020. It included expertise from the European Council and from the European Union and the Council of Europe. Currently, we can see the results of the reform through the new legislation and the reformed institutions that reflect a rule of law, human rights protection, and the independence of judiciary. Institutions that help to ensure the independence of the judiciary are the High Council of Justice, National Agency for Corruption Prevention, and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Those agencies also help to fight corruption within other branches of government. This reform completely restarted the appointment process of judges to eliminate those that are suspected of unethical behavior and organized the system in a way that it reflected the European standards of transparency and the independence of judges. However, even though Many results were achieved throughout this reform implementation process, and it was acknowledged by European experts that reform is very broad, and such a large-scale reform was not implemented previously. Economic Freedom Index still shows that Ukraine is pretty low on the property rights, government integrity, and judicial effectiveness that are directly related to the rule of law. Representatives of the Ukrainian civil society also argue that judicial reform is a long-term project that cannot be completed during one administration. Ukrainian government should have a common vision of the reform implementation process, and it should be reflected in each administration to come. They also state that a new strategy document is needed that should reflect the gaps of the previous strategy and the issues of implementation, which were the participation of the civil society and the public oversight, as well as the evaluation of the new system. Further modernization of the selection process of judges is also needed, since it's one of the most important aims since the Revolution of Dignity to achieve the independence of the judiciary. Thank you for your attention.